And I think we need to look at how do we extract it. And so with that in mind, we're going to kind of shift the conversation into, number one, some of the common questions that you probably have about programmatic, try to answer some of those, but then also provide some recommendations on what you need to be doing to take steps in this direction and to do it in a way that isn't extremely disruptive, because some of you will meet resistance internally. Others may not have the resources with the domain knowledge. So there's ways that we can approach this that gets you moving in the right direction without this being, hey, you can dip your toe in the water. You don't have to dive in head first. And so the first thing I want to talk about is the landscape. And this is an attempt from an investment bank to lay out the various players that currently are necessary for enabling digital media buying and selling. And allow me to convolute and make this the craziest thing ever. But, it really does represent the craziness in the marketplace. And all of these boxes represent different players in the space. And this Lumascape, some of you probably have seen it, some of you may not, really just articulates the transition from the marketers on the left side and the advertisers who have the money to actually getting that money to you in exchange for that inventory. And so it's a convoluted and messy space. Understanding it isn't really that complex. And so the next slide here, it's simplified. And this is something that comes from MediaCrossing. They did a great job kind of simplifying the landscape. But I just want to touch upon a few of the players here so that you have a clear understanding of what's going on, from the demand on the left where the advertisers are to you, the publisher. Oops, wrong direction. Okay, so what is a demand-side platform? Essentially, it allows buyers, the advertisers, to manage multiple ad exchanges and data exchange accounts through one interface, and it gives them a lot of power over, how they manage their CPMs, what kind of audiences they target, their performance data, et cetera. What emerged to kind of bridge the gap between the demand side and the publishers was the supply side platforms, which actually enable publishers to manage advertising impressions and inventory more effectively. So without that, kind of advertisers had a lot of control over the situation and they understood target audiences more effectively. But now we're kind of able to start to shed some light on this. Publishers can start to understand your target audiences and which ones are high value and offload those in a more effective way. And then in between both of these, we have exchanges. And basically all these do is what the name suggests. They facilitate that buy. The kicker in this ecosystem, this convoluted ecosystem of players, is the process between, an advertiser saying, hey, I want to buy this inventory, and the publisher saying, okay, I have it for you. This ecosystem, everyone takes a piece of the pie. So, everyone provides some value. We can call them value-added, a value-added supply chain, but they're all taking theirs from this process. And so the opportunity for publishers is, number one, to understand that some of this is by nature something that you're going to have to embrace and you got to deal with. But there are opportunities to remove some of the margins and to take back control and take higher CPMs from advertisers, and that's what we'll talk about a little bit. So bottom line, when you look at the dynamics in the current market, and you look at what the advertisers pay and what a publisher actually gets, when we talked about inefficiency, this is a great example of it, this inefficiency between what the advertisers pay and the publishers see. And so by any reasonable estimate, if for every dollar an advertiser spends, these different players in the market, as they transition and move the data, are taking a piece of this. And so, what publishers actually see is anywhere from 25 to 35 cents for every dollar an advertiser spends. Bill, I'd like you to kind of shed some more, and then we've got another slide, and this was by MediaCrossing, by the way, and it's an awesome way to view the market in a very simplified way. But is there anything I missed in this?
No, I think you've done a great job.
Cool.
For those of you that are familiar with MediaCrossing, suggesting that we're sort of where Wall Street meets Madison Avenue, one very distinct difference between how Wall Street works versus how Madison Avenue works at this point is in Wall Street, you don't have nearly so many players that sit in the middle. Essentially what's happened is in a more commodified and commoditized market, there isn't as much room for for so many players to take so much, sitting between a producer of a commodity, that is a publisher, and a user of the commodity, in this case the advertiser. So here you see this sort of extended food chain the way the market exists today.
Yeah. And the one thing I will say is there's value in what they're providing. So there is justified, it is justified that they take some. And I would say that some of it, is by design. And if you were talking to these guys, they would argue, hey, what I'm doing takes overhead and work and et cetera. But I just think, if we look at how the market's going to change and adapt and morph over time, some of this is going to go away. And they're not going to go lightly. They're probably unlikely to just say, oh, yeah, while we're getting margins, you're right, we're not the best, we don't need to exist in this ecosystem. So, all right, which actually shifts the conversation into what these independent media traders that Bill was referencing actually do in this ecosystem. And they're a fairly new entrant, and what they actually represent is they represent publishers, marketers, agencies, everything with a transparent trading platform. So they span across that whole continuum right here, which is very interesting because they have the ability to actually look at the market from a different a lens. And so sometimes they're actually referred to as market makers because very similar to a stock market, they will actually purchase media directly from publishers, and they will assume the risk of creating a market for this media. And they do that by operating very sophisticated algorithms, using their own data and their own technology that allow them to direct match advertisers and publishers and reduce costs in the process. So if you can circumvent some of these players by creating these very sophisticated algorithms that match the right buyer and the right seller, then there's an opportunity to actually give back to the publisher in this example a higher CPM. And so what's cool about independent media traders is they can give you higher CPMs by circumventing some of those costs. And at the same time, they can layer in transparency and insights into your subscribers, and they can kind of bring, what would otherwise be overhead, they can bring the expertise and the insights and the domain knowledge to do this effectively. And so 3 areas that I think are really critical that we discuss from a publishing standpoint, if you're thinking, what can I do to embrace programmatic? Relationships with independent media traders are a great start because they span the entire continuum, an entire ecosystem. And it's their job to basically shave off some of those margins, understand where there's opportunities for themselves. Instead of taking a piece of the pie and a margin, they'll look for opportunities to make markets and to manage the spread. So what's really cool from a publisher standpoint is 3 things. One down here, audience development, where you can engage these guys to drive incremental audience exposure of content and create premium inventory. Audience extension, you can use them to target premium audiences outside of your own managed media. And audience subscription, to create new subscriptions, and that could be paid subscriptions or it could just be registrations by leveraging programmatic. Bill, I would love if you would go into each one of these in more detail and just kind of maybe even give an example of how a client's used them. That would be pretty helpful.
Sure, you bet, Ian. This is, for us, a very exciting opportunity to be a change agent. Essentially what's happening here is that you have the independent media trader that on behalf of the publisher can help to build an audience. It could be that you're leveraging programmatic for the purpose that is buying programmatically in order to be able to drive specific audiences. It could be, for example, that you could use display advertising in order to drive video advertising, video audience consumption so that there's an arbitrage. It could be that you're interested in simply driving overall content distribution of what you've got on a website. But the first deliverable on audience development is specific to using programmatic in order to grow your endemic audience. Audience extension is moving outside of your own owned and operated properties, finding either the specific audience that you are already have on your site, identifying where they might go off-site in order to purchase unsold inventory at other sites that have this audience, or it could be a lookalike model where we're looking for people just like the people that you've got. So, for example, it could be an RFP that's come from an agency looking for more impressions in a given period than you would normally have on your own properties. You're looking for people who are in market to buy automobiles, and you're going to purchase unsold inventory on someone else's site as a part of an extended buy. In effect, you've created sort of synthetic inventory that you're going to sell. Audience subscription, that's where you're going to use programmatic perhaps to create registrations, or it could be paid subscriptions for your own content. It's very, very cost-effective to do that with programmatic. In all cases, we're talking about leveraging programmatic in an innovative way that turns everything around and makes this more beneficial for the purpose of the publisher. Beyond selling the inventory, using these tools to get the most out of your inventory, it's going beyond and using the tools of programmatic to build your business.
And that's what's really cool about. Go ahead, sorry.
I was going to say that you are reducing costs by doing this, and you're specifically building revenue at the same time.
Yeah, and this is where we kind of bridge that gap. So it's one thing to say, hey, publishers, you should be selling inventory through programmatic. It's quite another to say, how can you embrace programmatic to benefit your ongoing challenges as a business, to grow subscriptions or extend the audience? And so that's, I think, this should be the most interesting for you guys, of how you can embrace it in a way that benefits the business outside of of offloading inventory.
Right. Could you do this without independent media traders doing it on your own? Yes, you possibly could if you've got enough resources to pull it off. And this is no small amount of time or money or complexity. The nice thing about independent media traders is that they can step in. It's a variabilized cost where we are paid directly on our ability to be able to create value for you, and where we're bringing tools to bear that you may not have access to otherwise. This only works if the independent media trader reduces the spread between the cost of the inventory and what you can realize as revenue. So again, it's one more catalyst there that brings us into programmatic being useful for you as opposed to a detriment to your business.
Yeah, and to that end, I want to be conscious of time. We've got about 10 minutes, and I want to leave some time for questions and answers. But can you just kind of walk through, because we were talking about how you can effectively eliminate some of the costs in this, the current market. Can you walk through kind of phase 1 and phase 2 for you guys and give some insights into how this actually works?
Sure. So we just looked at the middle column in the previous slide in terms of the existing value chain within the marketplace. MediaCrossing is an independent media trader in phase 1 on the left side, seeks to shrink the gap that exists between what the advertiser is spending and what the publisher is receiving, essentially combining several of the technical functions and then sharing the savings such that the advertiser pays a little bit less, receives more for their money. The publisher is going to get a slightly higher eCPM and hopefully a better sell-through rate. So what we see on the left side is the trading desk approach. On the right side, what we at MediaCrossing are building to is more of a market maker model where we begin to bear more risk as we understand the market better. We're able to extract additional savings for sharing between buyer and seller, and so it becomes an even simpler value chain in the marketplace. So today we're in phase 1, acting as a trading desk for buyer or for seller or both. In phase 2, it's a more sophisticated, more risk-bearing orientation, much as we see in financial markets.
Yeah, and I think there are probably those of us among us on the phone that are like, oh, these numbers, this is not a fun slide to look at. Bottom line, I think that the key message here is there are partners in this ecosystem that you can leverage today to gain higher eCPMs and not have to take on the burden of overhead, to do this effectively. You can kind of partner with someone to embrace programmatic to benefit the business.